The human brain is fundamentally wired to rationalize the impossible. When a door, heavily bolted from the outside, suddenly rattles in the dead of night, we blame the wind. When a shadow darts across a dimly lit room, we blame our tired eyes. But what happens when the wind begins to whisper your child's name? This is not a tale of creaking floorboards or harmless bumps in the night. This is a documentation of pure, unadulterated terror. In the freezing winter of 1987, a young family, Mark, his wife Sarah, and their two little boys, 4-year-old Leo and 2-year-old Sam, were desperate. Mark had just been transferred to a sprawling rail yard in upstate New York. Money was incredibly tight. They needed a place to stay, and they needed it immediately. Through sheer luck, or perhaps a darker design, Mark found a massive, decaying Victorian house on the edge of town. The rent was impossibly low. The elderly landlord, a quiet, hollow-eyed man who lived on the ground floor, demanded a 2-month advance in cash. Mark, blinded by the relief of finding shelter near Sarah's sister's neighborhood, handed over the money without a second thought. He ignored the thick layer of dust. He ignored the profound, suffocating silence of the property. The layout of the house was strange, disorienting. A wide, groaning wooden staircase led from the landlord's quarters up to a long, narrow second-floor corridor. There were only 2 rooms in this pitch-black hallway. Mark and Sarah rented the first. The second room, located exactly opposite theirs, was sealed shut with a massive, rusted iron padlock. The landlord claimed it was simply used for storage by his son, who lived thousands of miles away. But there was something fundamentally wrong with that door. The air around it felt heavy, stagnant. For the first 3 days, a creeping sense of unease gnawed at Sarah's mind. A mother's intuition is rarely wrong. She felt a constant, prickling sensation on the back of her neck, as if unseen eyes were tracking her every movement. On the 5th day, the fragile illusion of safety shattered. Mark was called into the rail yard for an unexpected overnight shift. He packed his bag, kissed his family, and walked out the front door, leaving Sarah utterly isolated in the sprawling, groaning house with 2 helpless toddlers. Night fell like a suffocating blanket. Outside, the wind howled, thrashing the bare branches of ancient oak trees against the siding. At 7 p.m., Sarah stood near the entrance of their room, cooking dinner on a small electric stove. A thin, sheer curtain separated their open doorway from the pitch-black corridor. The boys were playing quietly on the rug just a few feet away. Suddenly, the temperature in the room plummeted. It wasn't a draft. It was a violent, unnatural freezing that pierced straight to the bone. Every hair on Sarah's arm stood up. Then came the smell, the sharp, metallic stench of old copper, like dried blood, mixed with the foul odor of damp, rotting earth. The scent was so thick it coated the back of her throat. Sarah froze, the spoon trembled in her hand. She slowly raised her eyes toward the sheer curtain hanging in the doorway. The single, flickering bulb in the corridor cast a sickly yellow light against the fabric. And there, projected perfectly onto the thin cloth, was a shadow. It was towering, unnaturally thin. Its limbs seemed too long, its head tilting at an impossible broken angle. The shadow did not walk. It glided, dragging itself silently across the corridor, right past their door. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. Her breath caught in her throat. She gripped a heavy carving knife from the counter, her knuckles turning white, and cautiously pulled the curtain aside. The corridor was empty, but the silence was broken by a sound that made her blood run ice cold. Click, clack. The sound was coming from the padlocked door across the hall. Someone, or something, was on the inside of the locked, empty room, and it was slowly, deliberately turning the handle. The handle stopped turning. Silence crashed back into the corridor, heavy, suffocating, and absolute. Sarah did not sleep that night. She sat in a hard wooden chair, the carving knife resting on her knees, staring at the sheer curtain until the sun finally clawed its way through the frosted windows. When Mark returned from the rail yard the next morning, he was exhausted, his clothes smelling of diesel and grease. Sarah told him everything: the shadow, the freezing air, the deliberate metallic clicking of the padlock. Mark sighed, rubbing his bloodshot eyes. "Sarah, it's an old house. The wind plays tricks. The door is locked from the outside. No one is in there." He dismissed her terror with the casual cruelty of a tired man, but the house was just waking up. Later that afternoon, Mark left for his second shift. Sarah had to wash the boys' clothes. The only washing machine was located down the creaking stairs, in the dark, unfinished basement next to the landlord's quarters. She left 4-year-old Leo in their room, instructing him to watch over 2-year-old Sam, who was napping on the floor rug. "I will be right back," she promised, unaware that leaving them alone was a catastrophic mistake. Have you ever noticed your child staring into an empty corner, smiling at someone you cannot see? Leave a comment below if you have ever witnessed a toddler interacting with the paranormal, because what happened next is every parent's absolute worst nightmare. Sarah was pulling wet clothes from the machine when a sound tore through the floorboards above. It was a scream, a raw, jagged shriek of pure terror. Coming from Leo, Sarah dropped the wet clothes. She lunged for the wooden stairs, her heart hammering wildly in her chest. She took the steps 2 at a time, bursting into the second-floor corridor. Leo was scrambling backward out of their room, his small hands slipping on the hardwood floor, tears streaming down his pale face. "Leo, what is it?" Sarah gasped, dropping to her knees and grabbing his shaking shoulders. The little boy pointed a trembling finger toward the open doorway. "Mommy, the lady. The lady wants to take Sam." Sarah's blood ran cold. The metallic scent of copper and rotting earth slammed into her nostrils again. She shoved past Leo and stepped into the room. There, sitting on the rug, was 2-year-old Sam. He was completely unharmed, but he was looking straight up at the empty corner of the ceiling, and he was giggling. He reached his tiny hands upward, babbling happily, grasping at fingers that were not there. Then, the temperature plummeted. A sudden, violent gust of freezing air swept through the closed room, knocking a framed photograph off the dresser. The glass shattered. Sarah didn't hesitate. She scooped Sam off the floor, grabbed Leo by the wrist, and ran. She didn't stop to grab coats. She didn't lock the door. She dragged her children out of the house into the biting winter cold and sprinted 3 blocks to her sister's house. When Sarah collapsed through her sister's front door, sobbing hysterically, the grim reality of their situation was finally revealed. Her sister locked the deadbolt, her face pale. "I told Mark," her sister whispered, her voice trembling. "I begged him not to rent that room. No one stays there. No one." The house was not just old, it was cursed. By 7 p.m., Mark returned, furious to find his family gone. He marched over to the sisters' house, demanding they return. Money was too tight. They had already paid a 2-month advance. "We are not leaving over a child's nightmare," Mark declared. He forced them back into the house. That night, Mark stayed awake at a small desk near the window, writing a letter to his parents by the light of a small lamp. Sarah, exhausted to her bones, curled up on the bed with the 2 boys, pulling a thick wool blanket up to their chins. The room was silent. Mark's pen scratched quietly against the paper. Sarah closed her eyes, finally drifting into a shallow sleep. 2 hours later, she felt it. Slowly, deliberately, something grabbed the bottom edge of the heavy wool. A blanket. Sarah lay paralyzed in the dark, 1 inch at a time. The blanket was being pulled down toward the foot of the bed, 1 inch at a time. The heavy wool fabric slid over Sarah's trembling shoulders, moving deliberately toward the foot of the bed. She held her breath. The room was suffocatingly dark. Mark's steady breathing echoed from the small desk near the window. He had fallen asleep in his chair. Sarah violently kicked her legs, yanking the blanket back up to her chin. She sat bolt upright, her eyes wide, scanning the pitch-black room. Nothing, the air was dead and still. She tried to convince herself it was just a nightmare, until a new sound shattered the silence. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the window on the far wall. Sarah's heart leaped into her throat. She slowly turned her head. The thin curtains were drawn, but the sound was unmistakable. Someone was knocking on the glass, but that was impossible. Their room was on the 2nd floor. There was no balcony. There was no fire escape. There was no awning, just a sheer 30-foot drop to a narrow concrete alleyway below. Tap, tap, tap. The knocking grew louder, more insistent. Sarah threw off the blanket, her bare feet hitting the freezing hardwood floor. She took one hesitant step toward the window. Suddenly, a low, guttural growl vibrated through the glass. It was not the sound of an animal. It was a wet, rattling human noise filled with pure, unadulterated rage. Sarah screamed. Mark jolted awake, knocking his chair backward. What is it?" he shouted. Before Sarah could point to the window, a tiny, terrified voice spoke from the bed. "Mommy," 4-year-old Leo whimpered, his eyes locked on the ceiling. "The lady says she is going to take us with her." Mark's face drained of color. The screaming had woken the elderly landlord, who came shuffling up the wooden stairs, clutching a flashlight. "Is everything all right?" the old man asked, his voice shaking. Sarah shoved past Mark, tears streaming down her face. "There is someone outside our window, and someone in that locked room. You lied to us." The landlord refused to look her in the eye. He stared firmly at the floorboards. "It is just a stray cat in the alley. The house is perfectly safe." His hands were trembling so violently the flashlight beam danced across the walls. He was lying. Sarah did not care about the money. She grabbed her children, grabbed her coat, and fled the house for the second time, refusing to spend another second in that cursed room. But poverty is a terrifying trap. The next morning, Mark dragged them back. He had argued with the landlord, demanding their 2-month advance back. The landlord refused. Mark, a stubbornly practical man, forced his family to compromise. "We stay for 1 more week," he demanded. "Just until I get my next paycheck." It was a fatal miscalculation. The next day was Sunday. The sun was shining. The nightmare seemed to have paused. Late in the morning, Mark took a towel and headed down to the basement to shower. Sarah stayed in the room to cook breakfast on the electric stove. She had her back to the bed. Leo and 2-year-old Sam were sitting on the mattress, playing with wooden blocks. The morning was perfectly normal until a loud, violent thud echoed through the room. Sarah spun around. Leo was sprawled on the hardwood floor, crying out in pain. "Mommy." "Why did you push me?" Sarah dropped her spatula. "Leo, I am all the way over here. You just fell." She rushed to pick him up, but as her hands touched his shoulders, Leo's eyes widened in sheer panic. He stared past his mother's shoulder, right at the empty space beside her ear. "Mommy," Leo whispered, his voice trembling. "She is right behind you." Before Sarah could turn her head, she heard it, a dry, raspy woman's voice, whispering directly into her own ear. "Get out, or I will kill everyone." Panic exploded in Sarah's. Chest, she grabbed Leo, scooped up Sam under her other arm, and sprinted for the door. She burst into the corridor, running blindly for the wooden staircase. She reached the top step. She was almost safe, but as her foot hovered over the second step, two cold, invisible hands slammed violently into the center of her back. Sarah was launched forward into thin air. She screamed, twisting her body mid-fall to protect her children. They crashed down the wooden stairs in a chaotic tangle of limbs. Leo's head slammed brutally against the sharp edge of a wooden step. A sickening crack echoed through the stairwell. Mark, hearing the commotion, rushed out of the basement wrapped in a towel. He found his wife sobbing at the bottom of the stairs, cradling their 4-year-old son, whose forehead was rapidly pooling thick, red blood onto the dusty floorboards. Blood soaked deeply into the white fibers of the towel. Mark pressed it hard against 4-year-old Leo's cracked forehead. Mark did not comfort his terrified wife. Instead, he looked at Sarah with pure, unadulterated disgust, accusing her of tripping and dropping their child in a hysterical panic. Denial is a powerful anesthetic. It blinds the mind to the truth until the poison reaches the heart. That evening, at exactly 7 p.m., the fractured family retreated to Sarah's sister's house for dinner. The sister begged them to stay the night, but Mark was stubborn. He needed to write an urgent letter to his parents back home, and his stationery was locked inside the cursed room. "I will be back in an hour," Mark declared. He zipped up his heavy coat and walked out into the freezing winter night, entirely alone. He returned to the massive, decaying Victorian house. The second-floor corridor was pitch black. The heavy iron padlock on the door across the hall gleamed menacingly under the sickly yellow bulb. Mark unlocked his room and stepped inside. The air was unnaturally thick. It felt like walking through deep, freezing water. Every instinct in his primal brain screamed at him to turn around, to run, to never look back. He ignored it. He sat at the small wooden desk near the window. He clicked on a small brass lamp, pulled out a piece of paper, and began to write. The house was utterly silent. The only sound was the rhythmic scratching of his pen against the paper. Then, it started. Tap, tap, tap. Mark froze. The pen stopped moving. The knocking was coming from the glass window right in front of him. The very same window that overlooked a sheer 30-foot drop to the concrete alley below. Mark's rational mind immediately scrambled for an excuse. A bird, a heavy tree branch, a prowler with a very tall ladder. He stood up slowly. He grabbed a heavy iron fireplace poker from the corner of the room. His knuckles turned white as he gripped the cold metal. He marched toward the window, determined to scare off whoever was playing a sick joke. "I am calling the police," he shouted, his voice echoing loudly in the dead, empty room. The knocking stopped instantly. Mark stood just inches from the freezing glass. He took a deep breath, reached out, grabbed the edge of the sheer curtain, and violently ripped it back. There was no ladder. There was no bird. Floating in the dead, freezing winter air, perfectly level with the second-story window, was a woman. Her skin was the color of spoiled milk. Her neck was bent at a grotesque, unnatural angle, snapped completely in half, resting against her left shoulder. Tangled, matted black hair partially obscured her decaying face, but her eyes were wide open. They were completely black, entirely devoid of white, and she was staring directly into Mark's soul. The iron poker slipped from his trembling hands. It hit the floorboards with a deafening crash. The dead woman did not open her rotting mouth. But a dry, raspy whisper echoed violently inside Mark's own head. "Get out, or I will kill everyone." Mark S. Mind shattered. The thick anesthetic of denial burned away in a fraction of a second. He stumbled backward, gasping for air that felt like razor blades in his lungs. He turned and ran. He did not lock the door. He did not turn off the lamp. He did not grab his coat. He scrambled blindly down the wooden stairs, tripping in the pitch black, and burst out the front door into the freezing snow. He sprinted the 3 blocks to his sister-in-law's house, his chest heaving, his face as pale as a fresh corpse. When he kicked the door open, Sarah jumped to her feet in terror. "Mark, what happened? You look like you've seen a ghost." Mark swallowed hard, his entire body shaking uncontrollably. "Nothing," he lied, his voice cracking. I got bored being alone. Let us stay here tonight." The next morning, at the crack of dawn, Mark marched straight back to the house. He bypassed the second floor completely and pounded fiercely on the landlord's wooden door. The old man opened it slowly. His hollow eyes stared blankly. "We are out," Mark demanded, his voice trembling with unbridled rage. "Keep the rent, keep the security deposit. We are leaving right now." The landlord did not look surprised. He did not ask why. Instead, a slow, sickening smile crept across the old man's wrinkled face. He leaned in close. The foul stench of damp earth and rotting meat rolled off his breath. "Do not be hasty, Mark," the landlord whispered, his voice smooth and cold. "Why do you not just send your wife away for a few weeks? Leave the young children here with me. I will take very good care of them." The sheer audacity, the repulsive, skin-crawling nature of the landlord's suggestion, snapped the very last thread of Mark's sanity. Mark lunged forward, grabbing the frail old man by the collar of his stained shirt and slamming him hard against the wooden doorframe. "Stay away from my family," Mark snarled, his voice trembling with a terrifying, protective rage. "If you ever come near my children again, I will kill you myself." Mark did not wait for a response. He threw the old man aside. Within 3 hours, Mark and his brother-in-law had packed every single item the family owned into the back of a borrowed pickup truck. They abandoned the 2-month advance. They abandoned the security deposit. They did not care. The only thing that mattered was getting the children out of that cursed, decaying house before the sun went down. For a few days, they lived out of suitcases in his sister-in-law's cramped living room. Eventually, they found a small, safe apartment on the other side of town, but the sheer trauma of what they experienced refused to fade. Mark and Sarah needed answers. A week later, Mark's brother-in-law went back to the old neighborhood. He did not speak to the landlord. He spoke to the neighbors, the people who had lived on that street for decades, and what he uncovered was a tragedy so dark it poisoned the very foundation of the property. The landlord did not have a son who worked overseas. That was a lie. The landlord had a daughter. She was 22 years old. Her bedroom had been the second room on the upper floor, the room with the heavy iron padlock. Years ago, the daughter had fallen deeply in love with a man her parents viciously disapproved of. They forbade the marriage. They locked her inside the house, isolating her from the outside world. The psychological torment broke her. One freezing winter night, she took her own life inside that very room, but the horror did not end with her death. Her parents, driven by a twisted sense of pride and ego, refused to perform the proper burial rites. They were ashamed of the scandal. They tried to sweep her death under the rug. Because of their arrogance, her spirit never moved on. She was trapped in that pitch-black corridor, festering in pure, unadulterated rage, lashing out at anyone who dared to occupy her home, and her wrath was fatal. The neighbors revealed one final, chilling secret. A few years before Mark and Sarah moved in, another desperate family had rented the upper floor. They had a 10-year-old boy. One afternoon, the boy was flying a kite on the flat roof of the building. It was a perfectly calm, windless day. Suddenly, the neighbors heard a blood-curdling scream. The boy plummeted 30 feet from the roof, his head slamming onto the concrete alleyway below. He survived just long enough to reach the hospital. Before his brain swelled and his organs failed, the boy terrified the doctors with his dying words. He told them he did not slip. He told them a dead woman with a broken neck had pushed him. This chilling documentation of events from 1987 remains one of the most disturbing, verified hauntings in the region. The father, Mark, who bravely shared this nightmare to warn others, has since passed away. We dedicate this profound documentation to his memory. The human mind naturally tries to rationalize the impossible. But the next time you hear a slow, deliberate knock on your second-story window in the dead of night, do not pull back the curtain. Just close your eyes and pray she goes away. If you have a genuine, terrifying paranormal encounter of your own, send it to the email in our description. Until next time, keep your doors locked and stay safe.